Yash Ramkolowan is an economist and managing director at DNA Economics. In this episode, we explore key challenges and solutions to policy design and valuation, emerging disruptors and opportunities, the digital revolution, how to make cities more investable, how municipalities can stay relevant in the future, the current status of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and much more. Yash, welcome. It's great to have you on the show. Give us a brief introduction to yourself and DNA Economics.
I've been with DNA Economics for almost 15 years. So the largest portion of my career to date. DNA Economics itself was founded in 2004 by my colleague Matthew Stern, and really I think the thinking when it was founded was to be a policy advice leader in the kind of economics field. And so most of our work that we currently undertake and have historically undertaken is policy related. We've undertaken work in a broad range of fields, from everything from climate change, kind of mitigation, advisory, policy type work. Historically, our biggest focal area has always been kind of trade and regional integration policy work. We also do a large amount of monitoring and evaluation work, and within that also increasingly providing advisory and support services to the private sector on financial education. And then finally, a kind of a broad set of work, if you want to call it that, in the kind of public finance, public economics field. So those are kind of the core areas of work that we've focused on. In terms of our clients, again, historically, we've had kind of three core sets of kinds of clients. The first is really in the public sector, and that's historically been various national governments in South Africa, but also within Southern Africa more broadly, so outside of South Africa. We also have undertaken work for provincial departments as well as for local municipalities in South Africa as well. And that work is really policy focused. It is often very focused on providing policy advice, undertaking evaluations of different policies that have been implemented, and then also supporting to design policies, especially at the national level, where much of the work has focused on policy design and evaluation. In terms of other clients, the kind of second core set is around our donors and NGOs. And that is really the likes of, for example, the EU, USAID, the UK government. And there the focus has often been around providing broader management services of donor programs that they've been implementing, but also, again, often taking time to provide them with policy advice, and then also undertaking monitoring and evaluation services for donors themselves or for the programs that they've implemented. And then the last kind of core area is around the private sector, which is one of the growing areas of work that we are undertaking. That is really more broad kind of advisory type work across the different fields: climate change, trade integration, and general public finance type work. But we also are increasingly providing monitoring evaluation services to private sectors, to the private sector, particularly in the areas of ESG. And so that is also a growing area of work for us.
What are some of the key challenges to policy design and valuation that cities and businesses are faced with? And what are some potential solutions?
If I take a step back at the very high level, and from my own personal perspective in terms of the work that we've done, I think the main challenge often arises from a capacity perspective. And so often, and we've seen this not only in some of the kind of work we've done within South Africa, but also outside of South Africa, is that there are no shortage of good people working in the various departments and in the various municipalities, both within South Africa and outside of South Africa as well. But I think the main challenge often comes down to the fact that there is a shortage of skilled capacity within these departments, and I think that is exacerbated to quite a great extent at the municipal level. And so even when it comes to policy design, um, often the capabilities of being able to design the policy are there, but for example, you don't have the necessary capacity in terms of the actual people to be able to undertake the work to implement effectively. But then I think the other major challenge has often been to monitor and evaluate the impacts of those policies, both before implementation and after implementation. So from a broader kind of challenge that I think is fundamental to a lot of the kind of issues that are coming out is around capacity. Um, I think the other one, and maybe just again from my perspective at the municipal level, is one of financial capacity. And I think this is especially true of municipalities outside of the metropolitan municipalities, the kind of district, well, maybe not the district, but the very small local municipalities, where in addition to the kind of skilled capacity in terms of human resources, there is often a financial challenge, even even the issues around, for example, corruption notwithstanding. I think there is a severe financial challenge that a lot of these municipalities face, and it's not clear exactly how that can be addressed given the kind of demographics and markets in which the kind of smaller municipalities operate. So for example, they often have to provide a range of services and needs in order to adhere to the constitution, for example. But the market in which they operate means that they can't often charge market related rates for the services that they provide. That the market in which they operate is too small from a demand side perspective, and that exacerbates some of the financial challenges. So for me, those are kind of two core challenges that I think are faced by the public sector and I guess more narrowly the municipalities in South Africa, more specifically. If I step back and look at a much higher level from a kind of, let's call it a more macro global perspective, I think there's probably two core issues that are now going to drive future challenges for cities. The one is around climate change, and so the severity and relative extreme nature of weather events is increasing, and we've seen that just in the last 3 to 5 years. I think it's going to continue to increase based on all scientific evidence that's available. And I think municipalities are not currently at a stage where they have been able to build a resilience against that kind of climate change impact. I think the other one, which again we see quite clearly in South Africa, especially for the major metropoles, but which I think maybe not sufficient attention has been paid to, is around migration related to climate change. And so what is inevitably going to happen is that you're going to see a high degree of migration from heavily impacted areas due to climate change, and that migration is going to have a very, very severe impact on cities in terms of their ability to to provide the necessary services and also to address the kind of issues that arise due to migration. And so I think those two kind of key areas around climate change are something that needs to be considered by cities as a very clear challenge in the near future. I think the other one is, it's hard to say how much of a challenge versus opportunity it is, but I think in the short term, it is very much a challenge for cities around the digital revolution. I mean, the immediate concerns is obviously the ability to provide um, a higher degree of service quality with much less manpower. And so what that ultimately means is that you require much less labor to generate the same levels of productivity. And then again, that has very clear impacts on um, both at a kind of macroeconomic level, but also at a citywide level, in terms of the ability for employment to be generated by any new kind of innovations and increased productivity at a firm level. And so I guess the question is, how do cities address that? If they're seeing increased productivity by firms, but employment is not actually increasing, what is it that cities can do? How are they expected to address that? How should they be addressing that? And then at a much more national level, that's something that national government, I think, also needs to consider going forward. So I think those are kind of the kind of broad global challenges. Obviously, within the South African specific context, we have a range of challenges related to infrastructure. And again, cities being the coalface of engagement with its citizens, cities are going to be hardest impacted by infrastructure deficiencies and the lack of maintenance around our various infrastructure. That extends from obviously the most prominent one being obviously electricity. Some of us might be in current load shedding stages at the moment, so that's a very clear challenge. But again, that extends to water and sanitation, transport and logistics, road and rail. So no shortage of challenges, I think, that need to be addressed at both a kind of national and local level.
Are there any specific cities or municipalities that are currently getting it right?
I probably can't think of cities offhand, but I mean there have been very clear examples. If I name three in terms of and kind of riding the kind of digital wave, Kenya has obviously been your kind of lead example around that in terms of using digital technologies, using telecommunications technologies to kind of hurdle your kind of existing challenges. So, for example, Kenya is probably the prime example of utilizing mobile technologies to roll out on a much wider scale financial inclusion and access to financial products. And so a very clear example of that. Um, I think from a kind of capacity governance perspective, to some extent, a country like Rwanda, I think, has been quite good at ensuring that it is able to provide a very clear route around how you can ensure strong governance, notwithstanding Rwanda comes with its own set of challenges, but there are elements of strong governance which can be provided as an illustration of how you might want to enhance governance, which is a fundamental challenge, I think, for a lot of South African issues that we are facing as a country. And then I think from an energy perspective, which I think relates to some of the infrastructure challenges we're facing. There's been a range of questions as to whether or not we are going down the right path by focusing heavily on renewable energy. And I think I can't remember the countries, but there are a couple of examples in North Africa where they have managed to roll out at a very rapid rate a huge amount of electricity generation capacity, which again could be used as an example for the kind of South African challenge that we're facing. I can't remember the exact figures, but I think it was probably in the range of uh, 8 to 12 gigawatts of power that was installed, consisting of primarily solar power, but I think a little bit of wind as well. And that was done, I think, within 3 to 5 years. And so, again, a very clear example of how, if there are effective governance mechanisms in place, and if I think the other key thing, if the public sector and the private sector can effectively work together, you can overcome some of the challenges that we face.
On the energy crisis, are there any municipalities that stand out in terms of getting it right, and how are they getting it right?
The most obvious example, I think, in the current context for South Africa is obviously Cape Town. I think Cape Town is looking very hard at the kind of regulatory aspects around electricity, which are impeding our ability to not only generate but also to distribute electricity. And so I think they're probably at the forefront in terms of addressing the electricity crisis that we're facing in South Africa. Uh, I think what they're doing very well is not only looking at the generation aspect in terms of how do you bring in like your kind of larger scale decentralized generation, but also what they're doing is looking very closely, I think, at the regulations to encourage your kind of small scale embedded generation to come online. And I think what in the long term the one thing we haven't spoken about is from an electricity perspective, for most municipalities, electricity revenue is their biggest source of revenue. Um, but actually, it's the margin on the revenue that's the most important. And so even if it's the biggest source of revenue, what you want to do is maximize the margin that you have between the amount of electricity that you purchase as a municipality and then the rate at which you can sell it. And so I think the other thing that Cape Town is doing, experimenting well with, is around feeding tariffs and trying to encourage consumers to sell some of their surplus electricity where it is available back to the municipality. Um, Obviously, at the moment, given the shortages in electricity, what you want to do is incentivize as much electricity being sold back to the municipality as possible. But in future, where you get back to, I guess, a state of more normality around your electricity demand supply balance, municipalities have a very, very good opportunity to purchase electricity at a much lower rate than would otherwise be the case. And so then there's a very great opportunity for them to increase their margin on electricity sales. And that in some ways could overcome the overall downward fall that they might see in overall electricity revenue. Again, I think Cape Town is experimenting very well with that. I know, for example, in Gauteng, City of Johannesburg has put out or is intending on putting out a couple of requests for generation, but I don't think anybody is as close to Cape Town in terms of being advanced in terms around the kind of generation transmission issues and also trying to address the regulations around that.
On emerging disruptors, what are the key emerging disruptors that you foresee in the near future? And what are some of the opportunities presented by these disruptors?
The other side of the coin around many of these challenges is the opportunities, right? And so I think from an opportunity perspective, I think there is a very good opportunity for municipalities to make much better use of the kind of digital technologies that are now available to us and that will become available over the next 3 to 5 years, or even the longer term. I think the main opportunity for municipalities around that is in terms of lowering the cost of services, or the cost of services for municipalities. So for everything, that there is an opportunity for municipalities to reduce the cost at which that service can be provided to their citizens. And I think the other thing, which is a very clear opportunity for municipalities, if they can use the technologies in the correct way, is to ensure that there is a better allocation of resources between the different services and offerings that need to be provided by municipalities. And so all of that comes down to them being able to access information and being able to distill that information at a much better rate than they currently do. So for me, that's kind of the key opportunity from a digital perspective. In terms of the kind of main disruptor, um, I think the other one is potentially around something linked to climate change, but what we haven't necessarily discussed, which is around the kind of carbon budgeting, carbon taxes issue, which again is very much a kind of bilateral country issue in many cases, but it has a very clear impact on cities. So, for example, in the short term, the EU at some point is going to be implementing kind of border adjustment taxes for carbon. That's going to have a very clear impact on your municipalities that are very energy intensive from a kind of manufacturing or industrialization perspective. And so very clearly, Gauteng will be severely impacted by that. And some of the provinces that are very mining focused as well. Because what ultimately that means is that firms in those municipalities are not going to be able to export at the same levels of profitability that they once were. And how do municipalities begin to address that? One of the ways is obviously to start shifting towards more renewable energy, because that lowers the overall carbon profile for all firms within that municipality. The other way, I think, is also to start thinking about kind of how are they able to generate their own sources of revenue around some of these carbon taxes and carbon pricing mechanisms. So I think those are the kind of two key areas around carbon emissions that maybe cities need to start thinking about more clearly.
How can we make cities and projects more investable? What are we not getting right? And how can we get it right?
For me, it comes down to two things. The one is around improving the transparency and governance in terms of cities and their offering, but also what their requirements are. So I think the more transparent and the better kind of institutions in place around governance, the easier I think municipalities will find in terms of attracting investment. And I guess that there's two aspects to that investment. The one is obviously investing in municipalities themselves. So, for example, through issuing of bonds and all of that. But the other one is also obviously private sector investment by establishing new greenfield opportunities and also brownfield opportunities within the municipality. But I think a lot of that does come down to kind of improved governance, transparency, and improvement in institutional governance, if I can call it that. Um, I think the other one is from a very South African perspective, I think there has to be much less focus from a municipality side around the kind of dogma of in terms of who owns assets. When I talk about who owns assets, I mean I think that there is a need for a greater dialogue between public and private sector institutions in order to encourage the private sector to invest in municipalities. But what that requires is that municipalities should be more concerned around the kind of cost and quality of services that are being provided, rather than who owns the infrastructure behind um, behind that service provision. And so I think that there is a greater need for discussion around how does the private sector become involved, and less of a focus on if the private sector becomes involved, who owns the assets. I think that almost should become a kind of second phase of any discussion that takes place around investment. But again, there's no shortages of opportunities for the private sector to get involved in terms of investing, both in terms of supporting municipalities to provide these services, but also in terms of investing themselves within specific municipalities.
On the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, what is the current state of developments? And what are some of the key opportunities and challenges currently being faced?
At the outset, I'm very pro integration, especially from a kind of African perspective. I think pretty much all of the pre-integration studies have shown that there will be a net benefit to the continent as a whole. Obviously, within that, you will need to provide more support to certain countries in order to help them kind of tap into the benefits from integration. But I think overall there are some strong benefits to integration for the African continent. In terms of the AfCFTA and where we are, as with all integration initiatives, progress can often seem slow. But I think it's, from an African perspective, important to recognize that there has been significant achievement in the last, let's call it 10 years. Despite the fact that the AfCFTA was officially announced in 2018, there had been a lot of initiatives prior to 2018 in order to get to where we are today. And so I think taking a longer term view around this is important. The most prominent example that we have for anything similar is the EU. And the EU initiative is a decades-long, multi-decade initiative. And so recognizing that even though progress is slow, there is progress is an important thing to do. And I think it's important to also recognize that there are multiple different interests, different stakeholders. We have on the continent 54 countries that are expected to negotiate around the African continent free trade area. And so it is important to recognize that these can be lengthy processes. Having said that, in terms of where we are currently, so The AfCFTA, I guess, is the first part of building towards the broader 2063 agenda, which looks at a kind of holistic union across all African countries for the African continent as a whole. So this is, I guess, to some extent, the first of multiple steps towards achieving that kind of overall goal by 2063. The AfCFTA itself, there's multiple phases in terms of the negotiations. So phase 1 and 2, and then later on phase 3, which has been added, will ultimately define what type of integration we achieve under the AfCFTA. In terms of the phase 1 of the negotiations, it's focused on trading goods and services. The most kind of well-known of these issues is around trading goods, because I think it's the easiest to kind of convey in terms of the practicalities around it. In terms of the trading goods, what the AfCFTA is aiming to achieve is reducing your kind of customs duties and making it easier to trade across borders at a low cost. Where we are in terms of that is the AfCFTA became operational, I think it was in January 2021, from a trading goods perspective, but actually there is no trading goods taking place under the AfCFTA free trade area, as it were, currently. The reason for that is, even though the AfCFTA is in force and in place, there are still tariff negotiations taking place. And so to date, I think roughly 30 countries in Africa have submitted tariff schedules, either as a trading bloc, so such as ECOWAS, EAC, CEMAC, or as individual countries. But there are still quite a few countries that have not yet submitted their tariff schedules, or have submitted their tariff schedules, but which there is still a process to ensure that those tariff schedules are aligned with the requirements. And so currently there is no trade taking place, but it is hoped that the tariff schedule process will be finalized within the next year. I think my perspective from a realistic look at things is that we are looking at probably another year or so before trade can actually fully take place under the AfCFTA. The other kind of key issue that often hampers the implementation of these free trade agreements is around the rules of origin. My understanding is that the rules of origin process has largely been finalized, and I think there is a manual for rules of origin in place. And so that kind of stumbling block has been hurdled and shouldn't be an issue going forward. The other kind of key area under phase 1 of negotiations is around trade and services. The trade and services negotiations will ultimately, hopefully, lead to making it easier for business people and for firms to let's call it, establish across borders and to invest across borders, and then also to operate across borders. And so that is really the key area of trade and services that is being looked at under the AfCFTA. In terms of the phase 2 of the negotiations, that is really focused on what they call new era issues. So looking at kind of areas such as intellectual property rights, investment policy, competition policy, and really the aim there will be to align policies and regulations across countries to a kind of standardized, uniform approach that all countries should have as a minimum level of operation. Those negotiations have not started yet. And I think there is an expectation that there may be a bit of delay to the start of those negotiations. Then the last aspect, which was a kind of add-on in terms of the phases of negotiations, is around e-commerce. Given the kind of strong growth in e-commerce, in digital trade, it was felt that it was important to include that as kind of a negotiating basis for the AfCFTA. That's effectively phase 3 of the negotiations. Again, yet to commence, but the hope is that there will be kind of a uniform approach to how countries adopt policies and regulations to e-commerce. Then maybe just the final thing on the AfCFTA, which I think I started mentioning, but I think it's probably important to affirm, is that progress is there but slow, and the requirements for integrating 54 countries across Africa. I say 54, even though we have 55 African Union members, because there is often a dispute around the status of Western Sahara. So I'm going to stick to 54 countries just to be politically correct. The integration requirements for 54 countries is onerous, and so I think we shouldn't be disheartened by the fact that progress is slower than everyone might otherwise want. I think we've made strong progress over the last 5 years since the establishment officially of the AfCFTA.
A big thank you to Yash Ramkolowan for this insightful conversation on Future Cities Africa.